Hello everyone and welcome back to Destiny. Today I wanted to introduce you to the Hunter Threadrunner build that I have absolutely not been able to put down. Not only is this build super effective with damage, but also maintains your health, reloads your guns, and lets you actually feel like Spider-Man. Let's get into it. Alright, so let's kick things off by taking a closer look at the Threadrunner subclass and taking a look at the aspects and fragments that are going to enable this build. First up, of course, we've got the grapple, and with hunters, specifically, hunters can leave behind a grapple point, which we will absolutely be utilizing to make sure we can get our grenades off as much as possible. And then we've got the threaded spike melee. This is going to be incredibly useful in those moments that we want to get away from the action. And then we've got our abilities. I usually go with Gambler's Dodge so that I can get that melee back at a moment's notice. For the aspects, we unfortunately only have two to choose from, so it's going to be the default options. Ensnaring Slam will suspend all the enemies around, and I have to say, this is probably one of the most fun abilities that I've ever used inside of Destiny, and you're absolutely going to love using it as part of this build. However, since this build is more heavily focused on grapple melees, I'm going to be really curious to see what other aspects they come out with, because as you'll see, Widow Silk is actually very valuable, and that gets you that second grenade charge and provides that grapple point when you do use your grapple so that you can refund your grenade energy immediately. Moving on to fragments, we start with Thread of Ascent. Activating your grenade ability will reload your currently equipped weapon and grants you bonus airborne effectiveness. I absolutely love this fragment because it's not only super useful in combat, but also allows you to maintain that really uptime on DPS, especially if you have a grapple point nearby. You're going to be able to quickly latch and detach and have your equipped weapon reloaded. The second aspect that we're going to utilize in this build is Thread of Generation, which is simply dealing damage generates grenade energy. This is the absolute freest way to get your grenade back, and it's actually really potent. Thread of Warding, picking up an Orb of Power, grants Woven Mail. This is a bit of a high risk, high reward build as you are putting yourself really up close to the enemies, and once you start using Woven Mail, you'll see how irreplaceable it actually kind of is. Next up, we have Thread of Propagation. Powered melee final blows grant your strand weapons unraveling rounds, which is already really effective on its own, but this season, especially with the artifact perks, unraveling rounds are pretty ridiculous. Alright, so let's go ahead and dive into the loadout. As you see, we've got plenty coverage for all of our champions. We've got those unraveling rounds for barrier, we've got suspend for unstoppable, and I've got my auto rifle for the overload. And speaking of which, we've got the Quicksilver Storm, which is essentially the gun that I have not been able to put down since this expansion started. I use it just about every single time I head out there with my Strand loadout, and it's just insanely powerful, especially with that catalyst. And then we've got the Interrogative Loop. This is just something I kind of threw on for now just because it dropped with Demolitionist. It's going to help you get that grenade back faster. And then I've been loving the Circular Logic. A lot of people use this as a primary, especially when patrolling on Neomuna, and being able to reload your weapons very quickly upon the grapple use is going to make that very practical. Alright, so let's take a look at the exotic armor choice. In this case, we've got Assassin's Cowl. You have seen this covered on the channel before in different builds, but it just fits so perfectly with this Strand build. Of course, it grants invisibility and restores a portion of your health on every single powered melee final blow, and finishers or final blows against more powerful targets increase the duration of the invisibility and the amount of health and shields restored. And believe me when I say, not only is that void invisibility so incredibly long, but you also gain that very large chunk of health back. That means you're essentially good to go for round 2, which guess what you have with that second grenade. So not only is this a high risk, high reward build, but it's also really a high actions per minute build. You really have to kind of keep this whole symphony of swinging around and diving up pretty effectively to be able to really maximize on this build. All right, so let's take a look at the mods that are going to empower this build, starting with our helmet. We have, in this case, we're going to start with a Strand Siphon. This is going to get us Orbs of Power with our Strand weapon kills. Very important for the armor chart system. And then we're going to go ahead with 2 hands-on. Our main method of dealing damage is going to be that grapple melee, and so this is going to help you build that super up a lot faster. Although if you do want to go for more heavy ammo, that's not a bad idea at all. Moving on to the arms, we're going to go ahead and start with our grenade kickstart. Doubling up on grenade kickstart is a pretty good idea, especially if you've got a grenade focused build. That's essentially all we're going to be using our armor charge for. And then we've got heavy handed. Now, the thing to keep in mind with grapple melee is that it does count as a melee kill, so we're going to have to go ahead and use heavy handed if we want to generate those orbs of power. For the chest piece, we start with charged up, increasing the maximum amount of stacks by 1. This gets us to 4, which I think is really the optimal place. You can go for 5, but you're going to be sacrificing your slots here. We've got melee damage resistance, again, close quarters, it's going to help out a lot. And then we've got strand reserves for some extra ammo. But here you can really go with whatever you need for your particular version of this build. For the legs, we start with stacks on stacks. This gets us an additional armor charge for every orb of power we pick up, which means that we only need to pick up 2 armor charge to fill the 4 that we have available. This is not only useful for grenade kickstart, but it's also useful for innervation, which reduces grenade cooldown each time you pick up an orb of power. Now, the popular and maybe obvious choice here is to use strand weapon surge, since I do have 2 strand weapons equipped with this build, giving us that extra 15% damage. And while that is incredibly useful, just keep in mind that adding one of these blue mods does initiate the armor charge decay system, which then makes your armor charge decay 1 stack for every 10 seconds. But if you don't want that, you can go ahead and replace it with something like recuperation, which initiates some health regen every time you pick up an orb of power. So just in case you're in the fray of things and you don't happen to get off a melee kill, you can utilize any of the orbs of power as little health pickups. Finally, we've got our class item, and we're going to go ahead and start with Double Bomber. Reduces grenade cooldown when using your class ability, and we're going to try to use our class ability as much as possible. And then we've got Reaper. After using your class ability, your next weapon final blow grants a orb of power. So you can see there's a lot of synergy here with the different armor mods. Now, finally, if you are watching this in Season 20, we can take a look at the seasonal artifact and take a look at the perks, starting with Untangler. Destroying a tangle with a strand weapon creates a suspending detonation. Allied Unraveling, rapid final blows with a strand weapon grants you unraveling rounds. Counterweave, when you damage a champion, you gain energy for your least charged strand ability. And Threaded Blast, destroying a tangle with a strand weapon creates a larger and more damaging explosion, which of course is going to suspend even more enemies. So as far as gameplay goes, it's fairly straightforward. You're going to want to go ahead and use your grapple and initiate a grapple melee for whatever group of enemies you can find. I absolutely do not hesitate from using a yellow bar as the thing that I impact if they happen to have rank and files around them. You know those rank and files are going to definitely die from this hit, and then they're going to spawn those orbs of power, which you can pick up to initiate your armor charge system. Now, you can go ahead and use that same grapple point to reload your weapon, and also chaining off that grapple melee again as much as possible. Again, the core belief of this build is that you are the grenade, so you kind of have to have that mentality, as you will be going in and out of close proximity to enemies very, very often. I essentially don't hesitate with too many different enemy types when I'm using this build. The only really thing I watch out for these days are wyverns, especially on patrol. I try to suspend them before I go about my damage doing duties. As far as tangles go, you can pick them up and throw them, which I love to do, but you can also just shoot them, again creating that suspending explosion. Of course, you've also got your suspending slam that you can get off. So not only is this build really effective at dealing a lot of damage, but it's also fantastic for crowd control and also getting in and out of sticky situations as often as you can handle. And, you know, some of those mods that we picked are absolutely going to help you maintain that uptime as much as possible. But anyways, let me know what you think of this build and if you have any suggestions for improvement. What are your variations of this build? Please let me know down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.